Hello, and welcome to Part 8 of the Unsolved Mystery Mega Iceberg Explained. Today, we pick up at about 1/3 of the way through Layer 3, so let's not waste time and dive on in. Father's Day Bank Massacre. On June 16, 1991, Father's Day, at 9:14 a.m., a man identifying himself as Robert Bardwell, who was the vice president of United Bank Tower in Denver, Colorado, called the bank guard's room using a street-level phone. He would ask one of the 4 guards on duty for entry into the bank through the freight elevator. The guard, 33-year-old William McCollum Jr., would get into the elevator and take it up to meet the vice president. But when the doors opened, a gunman forced McCollum to take the elevator back down to the sub-basement of the bank. It's important to note here that less than a year before, this guard would have been armed. But the bank had changed the policy and decided on unarming their guards. And that would end up being disastrous, because when the elevator reached the sub-basement, the gunman killed McCollum and hid his body in a storage room. During all of this, the intruder would set off an alarm at 9:20 a.m. when he entered the stairwell. The intruder would hurriedly go into the first guard room of the vault. There, he forced 2 guards into the battery room, that being 41-year-old Philip Mankoff and 21-year-old Scott McCarty. There he shot both men dead. Detectives are unsure about the third guard, 21-year-old Todd Wilson. He either arrived during the shooting or right after. Regardless, he was shot and killed several feet away from the battery room. In all, the intruder fired 18 shots, all hitting a target except for one. By 9:48 a.m., just a little over 30 minutes since he started, he would open the vault door. Unfortunately at this time, 6 vault employees were on duty, processing cash deliveries. He would demand they lay on the floor and cover their eyes, while he ordered the bank manager, David Baranko, to fill the satchel with cash from the workstation. He then forced the tellers to crawl into a small room near the vault. He locked them inside and made his escape at 9:56 a.m. The tellers were able to break out about 20 minutes later, though. Upon investigation, detectives would discover that the man had collected every spent shell casing that had came from the revolver he fired. The only actual evidence left was the 18 bullets he fired into the victims. Of course, this elicited a huge law enforcement response, as the FBI sent 40 agents along to help 20-plus detectives. A couple of things stuck out to them. One was they didn't understand why the man had stole $200,000 when there was more than $2 million in the vault. Secondly, why did he kill the 4 unarmed guards, but not the employees? Detectives assumed right from the start that the man was associated with the bank in some way, and since he had fired 18 shots, they suspected that he was a police officer, as that was the standard loadout carried by the officers on duty. Investigators would look through current and former employees and narrowed their search down to a retired Denver police officer named James King. After he retired in 1986, he worked at the bank as a part-time guard between 1989 and 1990, and he left the job just 10 months before the robbery. They would also discover that him and his wife had to declare bankruptcy just a year after he retired from the force and had substantial debt in 91, with up to $25,000 in credit card bills, or about $55,000 in today's money. He would be arrested on July 4th, just a couple of weeks after the robbery. They searched his home and they found no physical evidence connecting him. The case would go to trial, and the prosecution had shaky evidence. King claimed to have been playing a chess match at the Denver Chess Club the morning of, yet no one could vouch for him, and some accounts state that the club didn't even exist. The jury would deliberate for 53 hours, and King was acquitted of all the charges. There just wasn't any physical evidence. The FBI would keep him under observation for years, but they found nothing. In fact, he lived, quote, a hermit's existence, end quote, until he died of dementia in 2013. Flying Mist Mattress. In November of 2001, a woman named Judy, along with an unnamed friend, would have one of the most bizarre encounters we've discussed so far. According to her, the two were driving along Highway 36, when suddenly, in the road up ahead, the women seen a rectangular cloud of mist fly across the road at an incredible speed. It was said to have been wider than her car, about 2 feet thick, and hovered 3 feet above the road. And that's pretty much all that's available about this one. It's thought that it was some kind of freak weather pattern, or possibly even a ghost. Francis Marshall. On September 28, 1914, Freeman's Bay, Auckland, New Zealand, Frederick Marshall would go home at 9:40 p.m. that night. He would find his wife had left a key under the front door mat for him. As he entered the house and put on his slippers, He would step back out on the porch to wait for his wife. He waited for about 15 minutes, but she did not arrive, so he decided to go back in and wait up on her. But as time went on, he began to get worried as she never showed. He would get no sleep that night, but he still pretty much assumed that she had spent the night with a friend named Mary Ann Whitworth that she had been visiting. He would leave that morning and go to a local hotel in search of a job. After leaving, he was told a woman at the grocery store had wanted to see him, so he went to speak to her, and she told him that the police were looking for him, that his wife, quote, took very bad, end quote. And it's not recorded here how he took that, but it was just after this encounter, he would run into his neighbor, who would say, quote, did you hear the news, end quote. Frederick assumed the neighbor was talking about his wife being sick. It was then that his neighbor said, quote, your missus has been murdered, end quote. Frederick, not wanting to believe this, rushed to the Newton police station. Sadly, it was confirmed here. His wife of 20 years had been stabbed and slashed to death the night before. Police would grill him, and bizarrely during the interview, Frederick would admit to hitting Frances in the past, but claimed they had a great marriage. They were able to rule him out. Frances, who was in her 40s, had suffered about 25 stab wounds to the head, neck, and chest. Her skull was also fractured, and her lungs and heart were stabbed, and her jugular vein cut. She was found in a pool of blood and died quickly. The doctor deduced that it was most likely a pocket knife, and that the killer was probably left-handed. He also stated that the skull fracture occurred because the man was stabbing her so hard. No knife was found at the scene, and Frances had not been robbed. Also of note was Frances's left hand still had a glove on, while the right one was bare. Her small blue hat was also still on her head, but her clothes were all rumpled up, and her handbag lay untouched beside her. Detectives would try to put together a time frame, and discovered that she had visited her friend at 9 p.m. She left there about 9:40 p.m., saying she was headed home. On her way, she stopped and bought cigarettes at a shop. A 15-year-old boy would then state that he seen a woman and a man walk past him in that area at 10:15 p.m. It was the next morning that her body was found in a narrow alley by a young girl, or an adult man, depending on which source you read. I should note here, the detective's belief was that Frances was a prostitute, and had probably chosen to go to this secluded spot for a sexual encounter, but sources vary on the prostitute theory. There's very few details in this case, and it's one of the 60 unsolved murders in New Zealand since World War I. Frog Boys. On March 26, 1991, in Daegu, South Korea, 5 young boys who were off from school due to it being a public holiday would decide to spend their days searching for salamander eggs in the streams of Mount Warryong. The boys, please forgive me in advance for the bad pronunciation, Woo Cho-won, 13, Jo Ho-yin, 12, Kim Young-yu, 11, Park Chan-in, 10, Kim Jong-suk, 9, all attended the same elementary school. There was a 6th boy who was with them as well, but he decided not to carry on because his mom told him not to go too far. And it's a good thing too, because the other 5, they would never return. The police would initially label all the boys as runaways, and this would be a reoccurring theme, as the families have all said they were treated poorly by the police department during all of this. At times, straight out accusing the families of being behind all of their disappearances. But this story would become huge, and the pressure would mount. Even the president would get involved, sending 300,000 police and military officers to search the area. Mount Warryong was searched over 500 times, and nothing was found. Over 10 years later, on September 26, 2002, 2 men searching for acorns would find their bodies in an area that had previously been searched. They reported it to the authorities anonymously by telephone. The detectives ruled that they had died by hypothermia, but the parents rejected this, and they wanted a full investigation. And there's good reason too. For one, the boys' clothes were found tied in knots. Secondly, was unused bullets were found in their clothes, although the police stated this was because the military used this area regularly as a firing range, which will come into play later. Finally was the obvious. The boys were very close to a village they were familiar with. Something just didn't add up. It's then that the forensic experts identified blunt force trauma to 3 of the boys, possibly from some type of metal farming tool. Detectives thought it was probably done by someone who, quote, may have flown into a rage, end quote. Possibly someone with a dysfunctional personality, or a straight-up lunatic. As the press asserted, the police would also speculate that it could have been done by bullies from the same school the boys went to, But let's go back to the bullets found in their clothing. The area where the boys were in was sometimes used as an area for target practice, which is why the bullets were found there. Some of the parents have stated since that it was their belief that one of the boys was accidentally killed by someone in the military during target practice, and that the other boys were murdered to cover it up. There's also the thought that the boys were just playing around and got too close to the base and the military responded, possibly suspecting that it was somebody from North Korea, and ended up killing one of the boys and then killing the others in a cover-up. Regardless, the only proof for either of these theories is one of the boys' friends heard a gunshot and a scream, then silence on the day of. Crazy enough, in 2006, the statute of limitations expired, but by 2015, the National Assembly voted to remove the statute of limitations on first-degree murder. By 2021, on the 30th anniversary, the Daegu Metropolitan Police Department announced a new task force to the case. Gloria Sullivan. In 1933, a man named Clarence Sullivan would desert his 2 daughters and wife, 4-year-old Gloria and 11-year-old Theodora. Even worse was Gloria's mother Viola could not provide for them, and the kids would be put into a foster home. Even sadder was shortly after this, Gloria's mother Viola died. Now that is a brutal way to start this mystery, but things actually got a lot better. A very loving family in Chicago would take Gloria and her older sister Theodora in. The girls were treated well, and the family, whose last name was Brady, wanted to adopt, yet they couldn't find their father Clarence anywhere. By 1941, Mrs. Brady would pass of cancer. Gloria, who was 12 at this time, would become the lady of the house, helping with housework, as well as going to school and taking babysitting jobs. Despite the rough start, Gloria was very happy now. Her older sister, who was now an adult, moved out from the home and had her own life. Things were great, but by April 3rd, things would take a turn for the worse. That morning, around 8 a.m., Patrick Brady would give Gloria some money to do some shopping while he went to work. An hour later, Gloria called her friend Dorothy to suggest they go looking for Easter clothes together. Dorothy agreed and took a bus to her home. At around 9, the driver of a laundry vehicle would leave some clothes with Gloria, and a neighbor would also come by to get a vacuum cleaner that Gloria had borrowed. Finally, at 10:20 a.m., Dorothy would arrive and knocked on the door. She noticed that the door was locked, so she knocked again, yet no answer. She would look through a window, but the curtains were shut too tight to see inside. After about 5 minutes, she gave up and took a bus home. That evening, about 5:15, Patrick would come home from work. He would hear the radio playing loudly from the inside. Note here that Dorothy did not hear a radio. Patrick would then open the door, which was now unlocked. When he made it into the kitchen, he found Gloria dead on the floor, her dead body stabbed multiple times. When detectives arrived on scene, they said Gloria had been stabbed 20 times in her back, chest, and throat. There were multiple defensive wounds in her arms, and found near her body was 2 knives from the family kitchen. Investigators were stumped. This was vicious. Yet, there were no signs of sexual assault, and Gloria was fully dressed. The house was missing nothing. Even the $200 stored in a cabinet nearby remained. Gloria also had no boyfriends or known enemies. All detectives could find was a bloody palm print in the wash basin, along with a bloody fingerprint on the wall of the bathroom and a stack of bloody towels. And near that was Gloria's hairbrush with a full long blonde hair, which was odd, since Gloria was a brunette and Patrick had gray hair. They also knew that the suspect arrived sometime between 9, after the laundryman and the neighbor with the vacuum cleaner stopped by, and 10:20, when Dorothy arrived. Almost everyone that Gloria knew was questioned, but they couldn't find a motive, let alone a suspect. Gloria's older sister Theodora also had no clue. Detectives would hear some reports that Clarence may have been seen in the area. They even toyed with the idea that he was involved, yet they didn't understand why, after stepping out and ignoring his children for this long, he would all of a sudden want to do this. Investigators would try to trace him down, but it seems that he had truly vanished, and he was declared legally dead in 1950. Gloria's diary also revealed that someone had, quote, tried to flirt with her, end quote. They traced down this man who was never named, probably because he was underage too, and they were able to clear him. As far as the blonde hair goes, it was thought that that may have belonged to a friend that used her brush, although it can't be ruled out that the suspect was a woman. Gloria's adoptive father, Patrick, would spend his remaining days hounding the police. He died a few years later from a heart attack at the age of 59. Godard Family. On August 30th, 1999, Yves Godard, a 44-year-old French doctor and acupuncturist, saw his last patient in Caen Calvados, Lower Normandy, France. The following day, he would cancel all of his appointments and took his children fishing. The next day, he took a sailing boat, known as the Nick, from a port at Saint-Malo. His children, Camille, 6, and Marius, 4, were also on board. His wife, Marie France, was not, however. Godard told the owner of the Nick he wanted to go on a cruise and planned on returning September 5th. The following day, customs officers would do a routine inspection of the boat, and the officers noted that the children were sleeping inside. One officer was suspicious of Godard's behavior and contacted the owner of the boat, who then confirmed the story. Several witnesses would confirm seeing the boat between the 2nd and 5th of September, near the Bay of Braic. This is when things got weird, because the boat's small inflatable dinghy was recovered by a fishing boat on the 5th, the day the boat was supposed to return. The dinghy contained a jacket and a checkbook in Godard's name. This would prompt an investigation. By the 7th, Godard still had failed to return, and police had located traces of blood and morphine in his van. They would go to his home, and by the 8th, and found significant traces of blood in the bathroom, living room, and parents' room. Godard was now the suspect in a murder investigation, and an international warrant was issued. About a week later, on the 16th, the blood found in the van was identified as being that of Marie France Godard, Yves' wife, whom no one had seen since August 31st. Over the next couple of weeks, other items would be found, like a life jacket from a boat, as well as an inflatable survival raft that was recovered half deflated on the beach. French detectives were certain that Godard had murdered his wife and then fled. After speaking to experts on ocean currents, they were told that the items could not have ended up where they did by currents alone, that they had to be placed in these locations intentionally. 4 months later, a canvas bag was pulled up in a fisherman's trawling net. It contained numerous personal effects belonging to all of the family, such as clothes, licenses, insurance documents, checkbooks, and all of Marie's handbag belongings, as well as binoculars and a hammer. Over the next year, a skull was pulled up by another fisherman, and DNA analysis revealed that it was Godard's daughter Camille. Analysis at iFramer was able to conclude that the skull had been there since at least February 2000, which seemed to verify that the boat somehow sank, claiming the lives of all 3 aboard, although they still couldn't find a boat. But it gets even more bizarre, as Godard's business card would be discovered on February 11th on a beach, and then over the next few months, 4 more cards would be found. They were all analyzed, and it was discovered that all of these cards had been thrown in recently, like early 2001. Finally, by 2006, Yves' remains would be found on the seabed of Herd's Deep, but the mystery was only beginning. For one, his wife and son were never found. Secondly, no one knows what happened. Was it an accident? A murder-suicide by Godard? Or was his family killed by a third party who made it look like a suicide? Even stranger was in 2008, almost a decade later, Godard's insurance card was found in perfect condition on a beach. And by September 14, 2012, the case was officially closed, with the prosecutor saying, quote, "The only hypothesis we can exclude is that the family's disappearance was a simple sailing accident. And, even if it is the most likely line of investigation, we cannot formally confirm that Yves Godard murdered his family. The case is closed with no charges brought." End quote. Gordon Sanderson. On April 13, 1977, in Alberta, Canada, a couple were scavenging their abandoned property for a septic tank pump, and they would eventually come across one, but there was also a gruesome scene, as they seen a leg bobbling around in the septic tank. The decomposed body was wrapped in a yellow bed sheet and tied up in a nylon rope. The victim was wearing a blue Levi's shirt with snap buttons, a gray t-shirt, blue jeans, and wallaby shoes. The couple would immediately go get the RCMP, and 2 officers would arrive on scene and begin emptying the septic tank. The original autopsy determined that the man was Caucasian. They were also able to tell that he suffered some type of illness at around the age of 5, and he had died from 2 gunshots, one to the head and one to the chest, although there could have been more, but the body was too decomposed to tell. They also found signs of torture. He had been beaten, tied up, burned with a small torch and cigarettes, as well as being sexually mutilated with a sharp object. It was so bad that it took months to establish the gender. Although it's not been proven, the medical examiner suspected farm shears were used in the mutilation. The body had also been covered in quicklime by somebody who did not know that quicklime mixed with water actually helps dry out and preserve the remains. Early on, detectives believed that it was a migrant worker. They were also certain that he was murdered somewhere else and then dumped into the tank. Finally, they believed that his murderers knew him and were most likely locals. And if they did not live in the area, they were at least familiar, because that septic tank was in a rural area. The body would also be exhumed and tested a couple more times over the following years. After further analysis, they determined the man was of indigenous origins, not Caucasian. Finally, by June 29, 2021, 44 years after the murder, with the help of genetic genealogy, police identified the man as Gordon Sanderson, a 26-year-old from Manitoba, who was living in Edmonton at the time of his death. The last time he had spoke to his family, he had told them he was going to visit his brother in Calgary. It was further learned that Sanderson was a victim of the 60s Scoop, which was a period in Canada where a series of policies enabled welfare authorities to take or scoop up Indigenous children from their families and put them in foster homes, usually to be adopted by white families. Gordon had been taken at age 9, and when he matured, he started to suffer from addiction issues and run-ins with the police. Detectives now believe Sanderson was killed by associates of his involved in criminal activities. Police have stated that the likelihood that the murderer is still alive is low, as he would most likely be in his 80s. Granger Taylor. Staying in Canada, this time we go to the town of Duncan, which is in British Columbia. This is where 32-year-old Granger Taylor lived, and in 1980, this well-known mechanic would vanish one night under mysterious circumstances. At first, it wasn't noticed until the following afternoon, when his stepfather discovered a note tacked to his bedroom door, laying out his plans. On the backside of the note was a hand-drawn map of Waterloo Mountain, not far from his family's farm at Somenos Lake. The note itself was kinda bizarre, as Granger would tell them he was going out to meet an alien spaceship, as he had been having reoccurring dreams that assured him of a 42-month interstellar voyage, and when finished, he would be returned. He also left a will, which strangely had the word funeral deleted, and the word death replaced with departure, and after leaving that night, he wasn't seen again. By 1986, truck fragments and bones were found by forestry workers at a blast site at Mount Provost, and although DNA was not prevalent at the time, a coroner did confirm that the bones were Taylor's, and stated his death was due to massive injuries from an explosion. The decayed clothing found was also confirmed by his mother to have belonged by him, as she had sewn the shirt for him. The RCMP would investigate, and confirmed that the truck had belonged to Taylor, and they officially closed the case. And this is where the conspiracy would begin, as one of Taylor's friends disputed the RCMP's findings, claiming that they only found tiny fragments of the truck, and they never even tested for DNA, while other people in the UFO community, who had never even met Taylor, came up with their own theories, such as he had been relocated to Colombia for some reason, or that the US government kidnapped him and took him to Area 51. In fact, there's a ton of alien-related conspiracies to this, and that's probably not too weird, considering Taylor's obsession with them, as he had even built his own UFO replica, using 2 satellite dishes. The cause of death was also questioned, as there was only circumstantial evidence of an explosion at the site. Taylor's friends point out that the fact that a DNA test was not done on the remains leaves the possibility that Taylor is still alive. Furthermore, the reported blast site was listed as 600 feet in diameter on the coroner's report, yet none of Taylor's friends were able to find it. But on the other hand, there were some early signs that led to the thought of suicide, possibly from some type of delusions he suffered, because in addition to the reoccurring dreams about alien abduction, Taylor had also built a radio with which he claimed he could use to communicate with aliens. In fact, Taylor's mental health had reportedly declined in the months leading to his disappearance, and he was taking LSD regularly before he vanished. There's also the fact that neighbors reported hearing a loud boom the night he vanished. Unfortunately, that night also suffered a historically bad thunderstorm, and the residents are not sure if it was thunder or an explosion. Finally, it's also known that Taylor did possess dynamite, as well as telling his friends that aliens would almost certainly arrive when the weather was bad, so they couldn't be discovered. So was this a mentally ill man that committed suicide? or did something else paranormal happen? You decide. Grassman. The Grassman, also known as the Ohio Grassman or Kenmore Grassman, is a tall bipedal hominid that is said to stalk the woods of Ohio. It's supposed to be very similar to that of Bigfoot, but it's known to be much more aggressive than other Sasquatch species. The name comes from the small, hut-like living structures that it builds out of tall grasses. The first modern sightings occurred in Minerva, Ohio in August of 1979, when grandchildren of Evelyn and Hal Clayton, along with their friends, ran inside screaming about a hairy monster they saw down in the gravel pit outside. Evelyn and Clayton would go out to investigate, and they spotted the creature too. It was covered in dark matted hair, sitting in the pit and fiddling with discarded trash. It looked to be about 300 pounds. Strangely, they would see him many times after this. One night, it even peered through their kitchen window. Hal would go to grab his gun, but the primate was gone by the time he returned. The police were actually called after this incident, and they found several faint footprints in the mud, and a terrible smell that still lingered in the air. They would continue to see the animal over the next month, even seeing two of them together at one point. Things would take a dark turn when the family's beloved German Shepherd was found dead in the yard with a broke neck. They assumed it to have been done by this creature. Also, from what I can find, the deputies that worked the case stated that it was their belief that this was not a hoax by the family. This was not the first sighting overall, however. Going back to the 1700s, the local indigenous people referred to this creature as Wild Ones of the Woods. They would leave food out for the creature in an effort to keep peace. Similarly, in the late 1800s, many sightings were recorded near the Ohio River. Most famously was when one attempted to throw a man out of his carriage, but retreated when the man's daughter threw rocks at it. Other sightings have recorded this creature to be around 6 to 7 foot tall, with 10 to 20 inch footprints, and some of them have claws. They are generally estimated to be about 350 to 500 pounds. They are sometimes known to growl and bark, but other reports say it sounds like the cry of a baby or the scream of a woman. They are known to leave a foul odor, and in addition to dogs, they are known to kill deer, as many have been found in the area where the deer's liver has been removed and its legs twisted off. Grim Reaper of the Grand Canyon. According to the Redditor, Zombie Gandolfi, at some point in the 80s, his uncle and some friends were on a road trip when they decided to stop at the Grand Canyon and take some photos. They spent 15 minutes taking pictures and claimed to their knowledge they were the only ones there. And of course, back then, it took weeks to get photos developed. But when his uncle finally got them back, he noticed something bizarre. There was a ghostly looking image of what looked like a tall, pale, bald man in a dark cloak, just standing in the bushes behind the Redditor's uncle, who was dangerously close to the canyon. Quote, "In the picture, not far from behind my uncle, was a man dressed in all black with pale white skin, standing there in the brush, just staring at the camera with a knowing smirk on his face. My uncle and his friends claimed that they did not know this man, that they were the only ones in the spot, and the Grand Canyon was vacant of tourists at this time of year." End quote. So how did these guys hang around 15 minutes and not notice him, especially when taking the photo? Strangely enough, there's a few theories about this one. One was that it was a hoax. The photo hadn't been doctored, but the Redditor or his uncle are just pulling our leg. Another theory was that the man just stopped to take a leak and unfortunately got caught in the frame. Another one, which is similar to the last one, was just some man was at the canyon and he came over to see what was going on, and he accidentally got captured in the photo. Although, it's weird how they didn't see him. The last two theories are kinda dark. One is the man was there to commit suicide and was off to the side thinking about it when his uncle showed up. But the most dark one of all, this psycho was going to push the Redditor's uncle off into the canyon, but he only stopped when he saw his friends. There are similar crimes like this, where a stranger just pushes someone off something, most famously onto the subway track. But I couldn't find a case of this happening at the Grand Canyon. Oh, and one final theory. It was really a Grim Reaper. Hinterkaifeck murders. Everyone in the mystery community has heard this one, so I won't go into a lot of the deep details, I'll just kinda gloss over it. The Hinterkaifeck murders occurred on the evening of March 31st, 1922, on a small Bavarian farmstead. In total, 6 victims were murdered. Andreas Gruber, 63, Cecilia Gruber, 72, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, her children, Cecilia, 7, Joseph, 2, along with the maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44. They were all found to have been struck by something, as well as the perpetrator or perpetrators stayed at the home for at least 3 days after killing them. They also fed and took care of the animals while there. 4 of the bodies were found stacked up in the barn, as the victims had been lured out one by one. Prior to the incident, the previous maid kept hearing strange sounds coming from the attic, eventually leading to her quitting, as well as other weird things that were happening in the home leading up to the murders. The doctor on the scene did the autopsy and stated that he believed they were killed by a mattock, which is a tool used for digging and chopping, but the crime scene was ruined by all the people walking through the area. But like I said, you have heard all of these details before, so I'll skip to the suspects. The one brought up the most is Carl Gabriel, who was Victoria's husband. He was said to have perished by a shell attack in December of 1914 during the First World War. However, his body was never recovered. This theory alleges that he didn't die on the battlefield and instead went AWOL and came home only to find out that his wife Victoria had given birth to Joseph in his absence. Obviously, that was an issue. But what made things worse was who the father was, which was Victoria's father. That's right, the two had an incestuous relationship that was documented by the court and was known to the village, although it is said that he was sexually assaulting her, but the court convicted both of them, so I'm not sure. Another name brought up is that of Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who is believed to have had a relationship with Victoria and father Joseph. He acted very suspiciously after the murders. For example, when he and his friends arrived to investigate, they had to break a gate down to enter the barn because the doors were locked, and after discovering the 4 bodies, Lorenz would just wander over and unlock the front door with a key he had, and then he entered the home alone. When his friends asked him why he went in, when it was possible that the killer was still there, he said he went in to look for his son Joseph. It's also known that a key had went missing from the home a few days before. Although it's possible that Victoria had just given him the key, it is also known that he did disturb the bodies at the scene of the crime. The motive thought behind him doing it was that Victoria had demanded child support for Joseph. There's several other suspects, but to me, the craziest one goes back to the one we discussed earlier, the Villisca axe murderer, the man known as Paul Mueller, who is believed to have committed similar murders in the US before fleeing back home to Germany, and then committing the Hinterkaifeck murders. Iron Pillar of Delhi. The Iron Pillar of Delhi is a structure that is about 23.5 feet high with a 16-inch diameter. It was built sometime in the 5th century, after its construction was ordered by Chandragupta II. The pillar has attracted the attention of archaeologists because of its high resistance to corrosion. It's been called a, quote, testimony to the high level of skill achieved by the ancient Indian ironsmiths in the extraction and processing of iron, end quote. There are inscriptions on the pillar, but it doesn't really pertain to this mystery. The real mystery is how these ancient people were able to do this. I mean, they know it's due to a passive protective film applied to the iron rust interface, but I think it's more of a how did they become this advanced type thing, which has led to people speculating that it was, you guessed it, ancient aliens. Finally, it's not completely rust resistant, as there's some on it now, mostly at the bottom where so many people have touched it over time. Jason Ellis. On May 25, 2013, at 1:59 a.m. in Bardstown, Kentucky, police officer Jason Ellis was heading home after dropping off a late arrest at the jail. About 2:30 a.m., he left a bluegrass highway at exit 34, and on the ramp, he found some tree limbs blocking the path. He turned on his overhead lights and parked his patrol car to block the ramp and began clearing the limbs. As he cradled the branches in his arms, a shotgun blast rang out from an embankment. The pellets tore into his arm, side, neck, and head, and other areas not protected by his vest. He slumped to the ground with the limbs. By 2:36 a.m., just 6 minutes after Ellis got out, 2 vehicles waited behind Ellis's car. One man would get out and walk up to see what was going on. That's when he seen a pool of blood and ran back to tell the other driver to call the police. The woman called at 2:40 a.m. on Ellis's cruiser radio and said she thought he had been in an accident and was dead. The coroner would later state that Ellis had been shot multiple times with a 12 gauge. His weapon never left its holster. The initial investigation believed that Ellis had stopped to assist a motorist and was murdered, but they quickly determined the whole thing had been an ambush They were even able to determine that the limbs did not come from any trees nearby. As far as the suspects, well, this is a long, convoluted story, but I'll try to sum it up the best I can. His murder is actually believed to be tied to one other murder and one disappearance. But let's start with the obvious. For one, it had to be someone pretty familiar with the Bardstown Police Department, and Ellis specifically, because the police car he was driving was a shared vehicle, and I have no idea why that matters, but apparently that meant that the car didn't have a dash cam. Chances are, whoever done it knew that. Secondly, this person had to be vaguely familiar with Officer Ellis' schedule, unless you believe that he wasn't targeted, which the FBI said he was. Ellis was the narcotics officer, who mainly looked around for vehicles believed to be participating in the drug trade. It's believed that this is the reason for the murders, and who was behind it, that's the mystery. But there is one or two people that is believed that could be involved. One is former Bardstown police officer Nick Houck, who worked with Ellis, or possibly even Nick's brother, Brooks Houck. But why? Nick didn't even have any issues with Ellis. Well, this is where things get messy, but I'll try to keep it short as possible. Brooks would actually end up being a suspect in the disappearance of his live-in girlfriend, Crystal Rogers, just 2 years after this. And when he was being interviewed by the police, his brother Nick, the one that was an officer, called him and told him not to cooperate with them. This obviously looks suspicious. Nick would then fill a FBI-administered polygraph in relation to Crystal's disappearance. He would be terminated after this. But that's not all. Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, who kinda become the face for the campaign to find the truth about his daughter, would also end up being shot and killed while he was out hunting in the woods. And it wasn't an accident. He was shot by an unknown suspect from the highway, instantly killing him. Have I mentioned where he was hunting was near the Houck's property? Oh, and that brings me back to Ellis. The ramp that he was killed on, the Houcks also owned property that was within a mile of that exit. But why would either of them want to kill Jason? Well, first let me state, they have never been named suspects in Ellis's case. But it is odd, in this tiny town, that all the things that have happened seem to center around these two men. Of course, the cases might not be linked, but law enforcement has kinda hinted that it is. And the other suspicious thing, Crystal's friends said that she had told them she had a manila envelope with information in it in case something happened to her. That envelope was never found. Could it be in regards to Ellis's murder? Or possibly even drug trafficking, since there are a lot of rumors about the Houck's involvement in the drug trade, as well as connections to Chicago or the Mexican cartel. Jeff Davis 8. On May 20th, 2005, a woman known as Loretta Lewis, who was 28, was found floating in a river by a fisherman in Jennings, Louisiana. This would sadly be the first of many, as there would be 7 more bodies found between 2005 and 2009, in swamps and canals surrounding Jefferson Davis Parish. The other victims were Ernestine Patterson, 30, Kristen Lopez, 21, Whitney Dubois, 26, Laconia Brown, 23, Crystal Zeno, 24, Brittany Gary, 17, and Nicole Galori, 26. Because of the decomposition, detectives were not able to determine the exact cause of the 6 victims' deaths, although it's assumed they were strangled. But 2 of the victims, Patterson and Brown, had their throats slit. The victims were poor and had mental illness and drug addictions. They were also known to do sex work. In December 2008, a task force consisting of 14 federal, state, and local law enforcement was formed to solve the crimes. From the outset, they looked for a serial killer. However, once they started seeing the connections between the victims, suspects, and the police officers themselves, well, the serial killer theory was thrown out the door. And that's what makes this case really strange, is the tangled web of connections between the victims, suspects, and the police. As the police are heavily implicated in some or all of these murders, most of the victims knew each other too. Kristen Lopez and Brittany Gary were cousins. Brittany Gary also lived with Crystal Zeno. The women were all informants for the police in regards to the local drug trade. They also shared information about the other victims before their own deaths. The task force would reveal that 2 female inmates claimed a suspect named Frankie Richard was working with the sheriff's office to dispose of evidence in the Kristen Lopez case. The sergeant who took the statement would forward it to the FBI because even he didn't trust his fellow officers, and for some stupid reason, the FBI just sent it back to the sheriff, who then promptly fired the sergeant. and the allegation was swept under the floor. Then there's the chief criminal investigator for the sheriff's office, Warren Gary, would buy a truck from an inmate at a lowered cost and turned around and sold it for a profit. That truck later was found to be the one that was used to carry Lopez's body to a canal, and the truck had been cleaned down, so there was no evidence remaining. The police department claimed they did not know at the time that the vehicle had been used to haul Lopez's body, but they did admit it was an ethical mistake for the investigator to buy a vehicle from a prisoner. But it gets worse. By 2009, the sheriff ordered that every detective working on the case be swabbed for DNA in response to the accusations against his department. Strangely, they refused to comment on the findings. As far as suspects go, there's only one that really has kind of been the focus, and again remember, there's multiple suspects in this. But the main one is Frankie Richard, a local strip club owner and drug dealer, admitted to having sex with most of the victims, and he was one of the last ones to see Christy Lopez alive, and witnesses have connected Richard to the sheriff's office and claimed that they disposed of evidence at the behest of him. In fact, back in 1993, 2 men broke into the sheriff's office and stole 300 pounds of marijuana. When they were captured and interrogated, the men revealed their accomplices, which was Frankie Richard and a man named Ted Gary, who was the chief deputy sheriff. No charges were filed. Richard has been named a suspect in 2 of the cases, but neither charge is stuck. His criminal history is strong of conviction for petty crimes like drug possession, theft, and battery, but he's also had major offenses, such as aggravated assault, aggravated sexual assault, arson, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Finally, Nicole Galori, the last victim, allegedly told her mother it was the police killing all the girls, while another victim, Laconia Brown, said that 3 officers were going to kill her. Jim Donnelly. On the morning of June 21st, 2004, scientist Jim Donnelly would say goodbye to his wife and children and head off to work at Glenbrook Steel Mill. The Auckland, New Zealand native would park his car and walk into his office, and Jim has never been seen again. At least, not by anyone outside the mill. Looking back to the weeks prior to his disappearance, Jim's wife Tracy would tell reporters that something was bothering the 43-year-old Jim, but he wouldn't or couldn't tell his wife what was going on. But he was stressed and anxious about it. And the weekend before he vanished was the most bizarre. That weekend, Jim would go get a suit and tell his wife he had to go to a meeting. He would also tell her he might be a, quote, little fragile, end quote, when he got back. She asked what he meant by that, physically or mentally, and Jim would reply, physically. But Jim did make it back that weekend, and he seemed fine. But the next day would be just as mysterious. After taking his son to hit some golf balls at the range, he came back and told his wife Tracy he had to, quote, go and avert a crisis, end quote. He came home that night and didn't share what was going on. The next day, Jim would go back into work, and Tracy was now really worried. She would contact Jim's best friend Stephen, whom the couple had known since they were children. Stephen was going to get together with them and see if he could get Jim to talk. But later that day, he would tell Tracy that someone at his workplace had said a man had came the day before and had gotten escorted off the premises by security, and the license plate matched Jim's car. This perplexed and worried Tracy and Stephen. So Stephen went down to the steel mill in person to see if he could find out what was going on, and they would tell him that Jim wasn't there. So Stephen and Tracy would both return home, only to find Jim wasn't there either. Stephen would once again head back to the steel plant and ask them to look for Jim. This time they found his car, only it wasn't in Jim's normal spot. He had left it somewhere else, which was certainly odd. At this point, Tracy would go to the police. Upon their investigation, they found that Jim had stopped to get gas and bought a muffin on his way to work that morning. He then went into the mill, signed in, went to his office, placed the muffin on his desk, then changed into his work uniform, and that's it. He vanished. He was supposed to be at the shift handover meeting, but he never showed. His computer hadn't even been turned on. A search would be organized on the mill and in the surrounding area, but they didn't find one clue. Jim's colleagues were also spoken to, and nothing came about. They would also run down several alleged sightings, finding nothing. 5 days later, Jim's hard hat was found beside an acid vat inside the mill. They would actually end up draining the acid and found his work ID, safety glasses, credit card, cash, and his work key. Thankfully, there were no signs of human remains. The mill has since stated that Jim had left the site While Tracy believes the mill is covering something up, she would point to the night that Jim disappeared, when a car pulled up near where Jim was parked, which was not his usual place. And when the driver spotted the police, they turned off their lights and drove away. The location has been searched several times over the years, and even taken sniffer dogs, and they found nothing. John Paul. We briefly discussed John Paul in the last part of this series, as he is believed responsible for Colleen Wood's disappearance in 2000. John was a former professional race car driver and Wall Street wizard that got into a relationship with Colleen, and at some point, she vanished, and by the time the police were able to connect the dots, Jim had vanished as well. The two had planned to take a boat and sail around the world, and Colleen was so excited that she sold her condominium for $43,000 and gave all the money to John to invest. Around Christmas, Colleen had spoken to her former employer and told her she planned on attending the company Christmas party. When Colleen didn't show, her friends and family would begin to get suspicious. Her son would actually look up John Paul online to discover he had just gotten out of prison for drug trafficking and shooting a federal witness, as well as finding out that John's first wife, Chalice Paul, had vanished under similar circumstances to Colleen. But we have already discussed the missing women. The mystery is, where did John go? Detectives believe he first fled to Jamaica. They would receive tips he was there in 2002, and they went on their way to question him, but he was tipped off early and fled the country. It wouldn't be until 2004 when authorities again would be tipped off. This time he was in Fiji, and since Fiji doesn't extradite to the United States, there was little the detectives could do, and after he left Fiji, it's believed he stayed in Spain, Italy, and the UK for a while, before finally settling in Thailand. He would be spotted for the last time in 2009 in Thailand, and sold his boat in 2011. Kentucky meat shower. On March 3, 1876, around noon, a really bizarre incident would hit Olympia Springs, Kentucky, as farmer's wife Mary Crouch was making soap on her porch when pieces of red meat began to fall from the sky. Most of the pieces were 2 by 2 inches, and it appeared that it was beef. But after word spread, crazily enough, 2 neighbors volunteered to taste it, and judged it to be lamb or deer. One early theory was that it was nostoc, which is a type of bacteria better known as star jelly, which we discussed way back on an earlier edition of this iceberg, and that it didn't just fall, but was already present on the ground. It just expanded after the rain. Yet, no rain was reported in the area that day, but it would be analyzed and would actually be confirmed to be some type of meat. It's since been speculated that it was vomited up by vultures, as they sometimes do it as a defensive method when they are threatened and need a quick escape. And it's typical that when one buzzard does it, the rest of the flock do. But another theory, that is probably the most likely, was it was a hoax by Mrs. Crouch and her husband. In fact, these are the only 2 witnesses, and one of the first reporters to interview the couple was a woman known as Mrs. Houston, who worked for the New York Herald. After talking to the Crouches and their neighbors, she came to the conclusion that the whole story was a fabrication made up by the Crouches. King Ludwig II. From 1864 to 1886, Ludwig II would reign as the King of Bavaria. Despite his reluctance, he would play a key role in the history of Germany, as he and 21 other monarchs would become part of the official state known as Germany. As Ludwig's reign wore on, he would start to withdraw from the day-to-day affairs of the state, opting instead to pursue extravagant artistic and architectural projects. He commissioned the construction of lavish palaces, such as Linderhof Palace, and although Ludwig spent money from his own private royal revenues on these projects, he ended up having to borrow heavily from his family. His financial ministers advised him to economize, but he ignored them, and just planned further luxurious designs without pause. He would demand that loans be sought from all of Europe, which ended up with many foreign banks threatening to seize his property. When he became annoyed with his ministers, he started to consider replacing his entire cabinet. The ministers heard these rumors and decided to act first. They would seek to depose Ludwig by constitutional means. They decided to claim he was mentally ill, unable to rule. They would ask Ludwig's uncle to step in once he was deposed. He said he only would if the conspirators could provide proof that he was really insane. So the conspirators would put together a medical report. Most of these details were compiled by Maximilian Count von Honstein, who was tired of Ludwig and wanted him gone. They put together a long list of complaints, accounts, and gossip about how he was very shy and avoided state business, how he wasted money on these art projects, as well as being abusive to his servants. How true any of these are is anyone's guess. Although when they took the report to Otto von Bismarck, the legendary German politician who masterminded the unification of Germany, he straight up doubted the reports and stated that the ministers just wanted to remove Ludwig because they were about to be removed. However, he didn't mean go into the affairs or stop their plan. Crazy enough, the report was viewed by 4 psychiatrists who signed off on it by saying he was suffering from paranoia, even though they hadn't even met him. By June of 1886, the ministers would begin the act of deposing the king. However, Ludwig was tipped off and able to stop it at first. And over the next couple of days, there would be some back and forth, but long story short, by June 12th, Ludwig would try to escape and was captured by the conspirators. And this is where the mystery begins. The following day, one of the doctors who had confirmed Ludwig was insane decided to take a stroll with him on the castle grounds. On their return, Dr. Godin expressed optimism in treating Ludwig. Following dinner, the two would go for a walk again. This time though, they went along the shore of Lake Starnberg. The men were last seen at 6:30 and were due back at 8, but never arrived. The entire castle staff would go search for them, and by 10:30, after 2 hours of searching in the heavy rain, both Ludwig and Dr. von Godin were found dead in the water. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:54. Ludwig's death was ruled a suicide by drowning, although there was no water in his lungs, nor had he been suicidal, and Dr. Godin's body showed blows to the head and neck and signs of strangulation. The main theory here is that Ludwig had tried to escape while on the walk and he was killed. In fact, 2 people from the castle had been escorting them and stopped after Ludwig asked them not to come. The medical examiner stated there were no wounds on Ludwig though, leading others to speculate that Ludwig may have just died from a heart attack or a stroke after he tried to escape into the cold water, where his doctor also died trying to rescue him. But it's also been theorized that Ludwig killed the doctor before trying to escape on his own, hence the wounds to Dr. Godin. Kussie. Kussie is a cryptid believed to live in Lake Kushiro in Hokkaido, Japan. The animal is said to be between 30 to 60 feet long and a dark brown color. The neck is moderate length and humps are sometimes mentioned. The head of this creature sort of looks like a horse, only larger with silver eyes and having 2 protrusions like giraffe horns on top. It is said that it makes strange grunting or clicking noises. Witnesses who have seen it often report to feel uneasy, disturbed, or icky. The most interesting thing about Kussie is the high speeds at which it was reported. In 1974, footage was taken of the creature moving across the lake at breakneck speed, and in September of that year, a group of 15 witnesses reported seeing a triangular-shaped animal with glistening scales moving across the surface about the speed of a motorboat. In 1988, another witness on a motorboat reported that an animal with a dark back and looked like a dolphin followed him for a time, keeping up with the fast boat before finally disappearing beneath the water. But it's in the 70s that the cryptid truly became famous, as there were numerous sightings. A man in 72 said he seen what looked like a, quote, boat turned upside down, end quote, racing through the water. And in 1973, 40 middle school students on a field trip, plus their teachers, spotted the creature not far from shore. And in 1974, another famous case, a farmer reported seeing a large dark animal with several humps submerged with a huge swell of water and splash. This would actually draw out TV crews that would do a piece on the creature. Using boats with sonar finder, they would find large images at depths of 50 to 65 feet. One TV crew even managed to capture footage of the creature. The sightings slacked off some after the 70s, but the last major sighting was made by tourists in 2002, although sporadic sightings still appear occasionally. The strange part about all these sightings is Lake Kushiro is not really a good habitat for aquatic life. The water of the lake is highly acidic due to its hot springs and volcanic activity, which causes volcanic gases to bubble beneath the lake. This limits the potential food supply and would make it almost impossible for a large creature to survive. So what are people seeing? No one knows for sure, although it could be misidentification of trout. There's also the suggestion that giant snakes live in the lake, although it's pretty obvious that parts of this story was an obvious attempt at likening it to the Loch Ness monster, hence the name Kussie is similar to Nessie. Kuykendall phone stalker. In February of 2007, the Kuykendall family, as well as 2 other families, living in Faircrest, Washington, would be at the center of a truly eerie mystery. At first, It just started off as weird when the 16-year-old Courtney Kuykendall said that her phone started sending text messages out to her friends on its own. But things would get worse, as Courtney would begin to get calls at all hours of the day and night. A scratchy voice would deliver threats every day. The individual claimed that they were going to murder them, slit their throats, even kill their pets, children, and grandparents alike. The families would label the psycho as restricted, because that's the word that always showed up on the caller ID. But it wasn't just blank threats either, because the calls would speak about their daily lives, what that person was wearing, when they left their house, when they were alone, and even the code to their security system. One of the more ominous instances was when one of the victims was cutting limes in her kitchen. A call to her phone simply stated, "I prefer lemons." Allegedly, the families could even turn their phones off, only for them to be turned back on. Voicemails started appearing of the conversations the family had in private. One voicemail in particular was a recording of the family speaking to local police, followed by a warning to stay away from the police. Despite changing their phones and new numbers, the caller always found them. The detectives began to wonder if this was an elaborate hoax by someone in the family, and it was a bit odd that the other victims had really close ties to the Kuykendall family. When police tried to trace back who was behind the calls, the source always came back to the victim's own phone, even if that phone was turned off. And while police and the phone company were stumped, cybersecurity experts would actually say that it was very possible, and not only that, for a hacker group, pretty easy. One expert said the perpetrator probably hacked the website used by the cell phone companies, and then manipulated the software and firmware in the cell phones. After the FBI stepped in, the calls stopped immediately, and that's most likely because whoever was behind it realized they had broken some serious laws, including federal wiretapping statutes, and this person probably realized the prank had went too far and was worried. Most people seem to think now that it was all orchestrated by someone at Courtney's school, since she seemed to be targeted the most. Also the fact that a lot of the things the stalker said were pretty juvenile. L'inconnue de la Seine, or as translated to English, the unknown woman of the Seine, is a death mask of a young woman that was pulled out of the river Seine in Paris around the late 1880s. The body showed no signs of violence, and the suspected cause of death was suicide. The pathologist at the morgue was so struck by her beauty, he felt compelled to make a wax plaster cast of her face, although people had pointed out that the expression on this face could not belong to that of a drowned person. That's when the other versions of this story comes in. The painter Joseph Lefebvre said the impression was taken from the face of a young model who had died of tuberculosis around 1875, while other stories say the mask came from the daughter of a mask manufacturer in Germany. However, the identity of the girl has never been established, and there's not really any clues either. Although, some have speculated that she was probably around the age of 16. The popularity of this figure is pretty amazing too, as there were numerous copies of this mask made, which is kinda weird to me. According to some, tons of young girls at the time would model their looks on her. Most famously, and probably where you have seen it, is the CPR doll, which was created in 1958 and has been used in numerous CPR courses since 1960. And although we'll most likely never know her true identity, it's somewhat comforting knowing she contributed to saving countless lives without ever knowing it. Lars Mittank. This is another one that, even if you don't recognize the name, you will recognize the story. On June 30th, 2014, 28-year-old Lars Mittank traveled with 5 friends to Varna, Bulgaria. This was his first trip outside of Germany, and he would vacation at a seaside resort, where they relaxed on the beach and swam in the pool and went clubbing. The day before they were supposed to go home, Mittank and his friends would go to a bar in town, and Mittank got into an argument with some other German nationals over soccer. He then left and parted from his friends outside the restaurant and walked away into the night. The next morning, Mittank would turn up at the resort and tell his friends he had been beaten up by 4 men hired by the group that he had gotten into an argument with. Mittank claimed to have had an injured jaw and ruptured eardrum from a punch to the face. The doctor had advised him not to fly. His friends offered to stay, but Mittank insisted he was fine and told them to go on home. Mittank would then check out of the resort and find a cheap hotel for one night, which is close to the airport. It's the next day he began to act paranoid. He would call his mother and in a whisper tell her people were trying to kill or rob him, and to cancel all of his credit cards. The security cameras at the hotel would record him pacing up and down the halls, looking out windows and hiding in an elevator. He would leave for an hour at about 1 a.m. and called his mother the next morning, telling her the people after him were getting closer. On July 8, 2014, he was hoping to fly home to Germany. He texted his mother that he had arrived at the airport and went to the airport doctor, who later described him as nervous and erratic. He told Mittank he was fine to return home, but Lars did not leave the office, instead expressing doubt about the medication that was prescribed. At that time, a construction worker entered into the office as the airport was undergoing renovation. Mittank then began to tremble and yelled, quote, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here," end quote. He then got up and fled the office, leaving his luggage behind, which had his wallet, cell phone, and passport. Airport security cameras captured him fleeing the terminal. He can be seen jogging from the airport, climbing a fence, and running into a meadow, before sprinting off camera in the direction of an adjacent forest. This was the last time he was seen. There's no real idea if Mittank's behavior was caused by some real threat from another person, or he was suffering some type of hallucination. His mother, alongside some doctors, have suspected that his behavior was due to a rare side effect from the antibiotic he was prescribed, cefalprozil, which is a cephalosporin. It's been known to cause psychotic side effects, like hallucinations and paranoia. However, the doctor at the airport, Koda Kostov, said, quote, "He didn't take those antibiotics. He didn't even fill out his prescription," end quote. His mother has since said he had no history of mental illness, although that doesn't mean he didn't have a mental illness that had been dormant and was set off by all this. However, it's possible he could have had some type of mental breakdown, or the blow to his head caused it. There's been a lot of alleged sightings over the years too, even stories of people giving him a ride or meeting him somewhere, most famously in Canada, but also in Brazil. However, there's no proof for this. Other theories state that he ran off to start a new life, or perhaps he was involved in some type of criminal affair like drug trafficking, or perhaps wasn't delusional at all and someone really was chasing him and they finally caught him. One dark theory stems from the fact that this was in Bulgaria, which has one of the highest rates of human trafficking in the world. Another theory is that Lars' friends were taking drugs back to Germany, and Lars was left behind as an insurance policy of sorts. He may have ran thinking that his friends had gotten caught, and that he was soon to be arrested, and panicked and fled. Lou. On January 20th, 2008, a 37-year-old woman named Lou, along with her 4-year-old daughter, went into the Yuan Land Financial Building in Zhonghua, Taiwan. The building was a mixed-use residential and commercial building. It was late at night, and the woman came in, followed by her 4-year-old daughter, that looked confused. The manager was kind of suspicious, and at first didn't want to let them in, but the woman said she had came looking for a friend, so they let her in, and she went into the elevator with her daughter. The next morning, the manager did not see the two leave. He started to suspect that she had went in to commit suicide, which is fairly common. He checked the security footage and noticed that Miss Lou entered the elevator looking very frightened and nervous. And when the door shut, once they reached the 11th floor, she hugged her daughter and then removed her red jacket along with her 4-year-old's pink jacket and threw them on the floor. She even took off their shoes. They would then dash out of the elevator and out of sight of the camera. The manager suspected she probably jumped off the building, and that was why she had taken her shoes off, but he didn't quite understand why she had taken their jackets off. Regardless, he called the police. When they arrived and viewed the footage, they too believed she had committed suicide. Dozens of officers searched around the building, but there was no sign of her or her daughter. They eventually went back into the building and searched as much as they could, although they didn't have search warrants and weren't allowed to search every room. Yet again, nothing. And reminiscent of Elisa Lam, they would go check the water tank and pipes, yet no trace was found. They would also ask many people at the building, yet no one had seen her. It was after this that the news spread, and a man called claiming that he was her husband. He said they had 4 children together, but they had been separated for about a year. He claimed she was raising the 4 children while he was paying the child support. He further said that the oldest daughter, who was around 11 years old, stated her mom had told her that she was going to take the youngest daughter, the one on the security footage, to a relative's place for a few days. That was 14 years ago, and they haven't been sighted since. The story is kinda hard to follow due to the different versions told and the translation issues, but some say there's no mystery at all, and that Miss Lou spent the night with someone she knew. Yet that doesn't explain why her separated husband called police to confirm that she was missing, or why her oldest daughter, now an adult, would confirm in an interview a decade later that her mom stated that she was taking her youngest sister to a relative's There's other sources that stated that she left through a stairway and through a parking garage, which is why she wasn't seen on camera. Although a local politician stated that she strongly suspects Miss Lou is dead, mainly because her daughter never registered for school and her national health insurance card has not been used since her disappearance. Loch Ness Monster. You had to know it was coming, and I'm surprised it's this far down the list, since it and Sasquatch are the most famous cryptids in the world. But the Loch Ness Monster, or as we termed it earlier, Nessie, is a cryptid that is said to inhabit Loch Ness in Scotland. It is often described as a large, long-necked creature with one or more humps protruding from the water. It has a sleek, rubbery blackish-gray skin and is about 20 feet long. Its head is often described as horse-shaped, and may even have a straggly mane running down its neck. Some witnesses even report horns or a crest, while others report a turtle-like head. There have actually been sightings of this creature going way back, potentially even to 565 AD, when a man was supposedly killed by a creature in the river Ness, but the story didn't really take off until 1933, when 4 well-documented sightings occurred. But perhaps most famously was the photograph that would be taken a year later in 1934, which has become known as the surgeon's photograph, since the man taking it, Robert Kenneth Wilson, did not want to be affiliated with it. According to Wilson, when he seen it, he grabbed his camera and he took 4 pictures. 2 of these would come out clearly, which shows a small head and a back, while the second one shows a similar head in a diving position. Cryptid believers have pointed to the photo for nearly a century as proof that the cryptid is real, but it's mostly agreed now that it was a hoax. Ever since the photo, there's been several witnesses claimed to have seen it, and several searches taken place, but none of them have come up with any conclusive evidence. As for what the creature really is, one common suggestion is that it's a eel, which are found in Loch Ness, and an unusually large one would explain it. Jeremy Wade, of the TV show River Monsters, believed the creature to be a Greenland shark, which inhabits the North Atlantic Ocean. It can get up to 20 feet long and is dark in color, and can live in freshwater. There's also been similar lines of thought that it is a whale's catfish or some type of local animal. Then there's the more mundane ones like tree trunks, logs, optical illusions, seismic gas, and just straight up hoaxes. And last but not least, is it some kind of leftover dinosaur like a plesiosaur, or perhaps some type of undiscovered giant amphibian? Madeleine McCann, and another case that you almost certainly have heard of. Even people without an interest in mysteries have heard of this. I mean, it has even been described as the most heavily reported missing person case in modern history, so I won't be doing a deep dive on this one. Madeleine McCann, of Leicester, England, was a 3-year-old girl who disappeared in Praia da Luz, Portugal in 2007. Her parents are both physicians and had made it to Portugal on April 28th for a 7-day spring break vacation. The family was staying in an apartment in an area known as Little Britain because a lot of British people stayed there during the holidays. The apartment had sliding glass patio doors in the living room that looked out over a top-end restaurant and bar. The McCann's children slept in a bedroom next to the front door, which the McCanns kept locked. It had one waist-high window with curtains and a metal exterior shutter, which the McCanns kept closed. Madeleine slept in a single bed next to the bedroom door on the opposite side of the window. The last day there, the parents would go to the Tapez restaurant at 8:30 p.m., which was only about 180 feet from the apartment, as the crow flies, that is. Actually getting there required a bit more of a walk around first, making the journey about 295 feet. The top of the apartment was visible from the restaurant, but not the doors. The McCanns would also leave the patio doors unlocked, so they could let themselves in to check on the children. The parents would go check every 30 minutes on the children. Kate had intended to go at 9:30, but one of the 7 friends that the McCanns had went on this trip with, Matthew Oldfield, offered to look when he went to check on his own children, which was right next door. He would step into the apartment, but heard no noise. He then left, without looking far enough in to see if Madeleine was there or not. Of course, police would at first believe he was involved in handing Madeleine off to someone, but he was quickly ruled out. And besides, detectives were now sure that Madeleine was abducted after this, probably just a few minutes before Madeleine's mother, Kate, would do her own check at 10 p.m. When she tried to shut the bedroom door, it slammed as if there was a draft. She looked in to see the bedroom window was wide open, and Madeleine was gone. Kate would run out screaming, "Madeleine's gone, someone's taking her." Much has been made about the Portuguese police response, which was poor from the get-go. No descriptions were given out until several hours later. No house-to-house searches made. Roadblocks weren't even put up until 12 hours later, at 10 a.m. the next morning. They also didn't request surveillance photos of vehicles leaving the area that night, as well as the crime scene was not secured. Yes, it was not secured in 2007. Think about that. I know this feels like something from a case in 1900. That's how bad this was. There are so many red herrings and early suspects that it's hard to keep up with. Some witnesses describe men behaving oddly near the apartment the days before and the day of. They were thought to be doing reconnaissance for a possible burglary. There were other reports that suspicious men were going around asking for charity for an orphanage that didn't exist. There was also a report of an ugly man seen across the road watching the apartments. Of course, the biggest was that the parents were involved, but they were eventually ruled out. In 2022, a new suspect appeared, a man named Christian Bruckner. He is already in prison in Germany for the sexual assault and murder of a 72-year-old woman, and he's been charged with multiple offenses since. He had already been previously convicted for sex crimes, and it's believed he lived in the area where Madeleine was abducted between 1995 and 2007. The German authorities claim they have, quote, concrete proof, end quote. Yet this still hasn't surfaced, leaving many to believe they were wrong, or that it won't be as easy to prove as they first thought. Mary Celeste, another well-known one here, and just like the last one, you probably don't need a deep dive, so I'll just try to keep it short. The Mary Celeste was an American merchant ship found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the Azores on December 4th, 1872. The captain and crew were all missing. However, the ship was still seaworthy, and their provisions were still good, and the load of alcohol they were transporting was still in the hull. The ship's captain was a man named Benjamin Briggs, and he had a high standing in the profession. He also picked a very experienced and talented crew. They left port on November 7th, just as a Canadian ship, De Gracia, was in nearby Hoboken, New Jersey, awaiting a cargo of petroleum. The ship was captained by Davy Morehouse, and would leave port 8 days after the Mary Celeste on the 15th. By December 4th, Captain Morehouse was made aware of a vessel about 6 miles away, heading towards them. The ship was moving erratically, and the sails didn't look right. Morehouse suspected something was wrong, so they pulled closer. He would note that he saw nobody on deck, and no one replied to their signals. 2 men would be deployed in a smaller boat to investigate, and it was here that they realized that it was the Mary Celeste. They would climb aboard and found the rigging was damaged and the ropes hung loosely over the sides. The sails were partially set and in poor condition, and some of them were missing. The ship's lifeboat was also missing. There was a little bit of water in the hold, but not an alarming amount. They found the ship's log, and it revealed the last entry had came 9 days earlier. They also noted the ship's papers, along with the captain's navigational instruments, were all missing. There were no signs of fire or violence, and it seemed like an orderly departure occurred. Captain Morehouse would decide to bring the ship to Gibraltar, as he would be awarded a substantial share for the salvage. Investigations would happen soon, and, well, there were many theories. The early inspection ruled out weather events, citing a vial of sewing machine oil, which is found upright in place. There were also a couple of stains found that was thought might be blood, particularly one on the railing that bore a deep mark, possibly caused by an axe, as well as some staining on the captain's sword. The going theory was that the men of the crew got into a drunken frenzy and killed the captain and first mate, and then made the ship look like it had been in a collision, before fleeing in the lifeboat. He also thought that Morehouse and his crew were hiding something. However, that fell apart when it was determined that the stains found on the sword and ship were not blood. And ever since then, well, opinions vary. It's probably not something like insurance fraud, just for the fact that Briggs left his son Arthur behind, and it's hard to imagine he would do that if he planned to disappear permanently. Pirates have also been bandied about, but why didn't they steal the cargo? The main theory today is the men got off the ship due to some type of emergency, and tethered a rope from the ship to the lifeboat. The rope then either broke, or came undone, leaving the men to drift aimlessly. There's even been some conjecture that the men were afraid the ship's cargo of alcohol was about to explode, or perhaps a candle fell and with the fumes caused some kind of fireball that frightened the sailors, but ended up doing no damage to the ship. But this overlooks the obvious. Why would you tie yourself to a ship that might explode or sink? Furthermore, Captain Briggs was an experienced sailor and probably wouldn't do that, as he would know a ship with some damage was still more safe than a lifeboat. Other things like underwater earthquakes have been proposed, as well as the crew running aground and getting off onto the lifeboat, only to have the ship be blown back out into the sea. Melon Heads. In Ohio, Michigan, and Connecticut, there are strange reports of beings described as small humanoids that have heads shaped like a melon that sometimes hide and wait for an unsuspecting traveler to go by, where they will then run out and attack them. In Michigan, they are said to reside around Felt Mansion, and the legend states that children with hydrocephalus, which causes large amounts of fluid to be trapped inside the brain cavity, resulting in physical swelling, lived in the Junction Insane Asylum nearby that are responsible. As the story goes, after enduring physical and emotional abuse, they escaped into the forest surrounding the asylum and became feral, although the Allegan County Historical Society disputes this and claims that an asylum never existed there. In Ohio, they are associated with the Cleveland suburb of Kirtland. They were originally said to be orphans under the watch of a man known only as Dr. Crow. He was said to have performed experiments on them, which caused their large hairless melon heads. Allegedly, the children, who were tired of the experiments, rose up and killed the doctor and escaped, and can be spotted occasionally in the Kirtland area today. Connecticut sightings are far more widespread, but appear more often in Litchfield County and Fairfield County. The legend here is a bit different, as supposedly an asylum burnt down in 1960, killing all of the staff, but 10 to 20 inmates escaped, and the only means they had to survive was cannibalism, and that they also resorted to inbreeding, which in turn caused them to develop hydrocephalus. There's another variation of this story that states that the Melon Heads are descendants of a colonial-era family from Shelton, Trumbull, who were banished after accusations of witchcraft were made against them, causing them to retreat into the woods, where again, due to inbreeding, their heads took the shape of a melon. They supposedly prey on humans who wander into their territory. In Connecticut, there's one characteristic all of these legends have in common, and that is, they seem to take place on a secluded, usually single dirt road. ILMH 370. Again, a super famous one, that I'm going to assume anyone listening remembers this pretty vividly. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 would depart from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia, headed for Beijing Capital International Airport. The crew would last communicate with the air traffic control about 38 minutes after takeoff, when it was then over the South China Sea. It would be lost from the radar screens just minutes later, but was tracked by military radar for another hour, and they noticed it was deviating westward from its planned flight path, crossing the Malay Peninsula, and would not be seen again. The search for the plane is the most expensive search in the history of aviation, originally starting off in the South China Sea, but eventually, after further analysis, it was believed to have crashed somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. And although several pieces of debris have washed ashore in the western Indian Ocean in 2015 and 16 that were confirmed to be from the aircraft, the plane was never found. Since then, there have been several theories proposed to explain the disappearance. One of them, that has been proposed from early on, is a hypoxia event, which is caused by an uncontrolled decompression. It's thought that some kind of mechanical failure, or human error, caused the aircraft to depressurize, causing everyone to lose consciousness, and then the plane just flew until it ran out of fuel. Another early thought was some type of passenger involvement, aka a hijacking. They would actually find out pretty quick that 2 of the men boarded with stolen passports. The 2 documents were stolen in Thailand, and they were taken from an Austrian man and 1 Italian man. These 2 people had also purchased one-way tickets. Suspicions were heightened when they found out the men were Iranians, but it was deduced pretty quickly that the men were most likely asylum seekers, and most investigators ruled out terrorism. From the US perspective, they have claimed the most likely explanation was that someone in the cockpit reprogrammed the aircraft's autopilot to travel south across the Indian Ocean. The FBI would even help on the investigation, and found that Captain Zahari had used a flight simulator on his home PC that had a route very similar to the one the plane actually took, and that had been deleted before the FBI recovered it. But it's been cautioned, that doesn't necessarily mean he done it, as people use that simulator to fly many different routes. But many media reports would claim that the Malaysian authorities had identified Captain Zahari as the suspect, if, and this is a big if, it was done intentionally. Another one that has been proposed was a fire, most likely stemming from some lithium batteries that were carried on board. Those are the ones known as the major theories. After this, we have a lot more, but these theories are a little out there and usually don't have a lot of backing. I will just brush over these. Going off the hijacking theory, some people speculated that a jihadist attack was responsible and took the plane to Pakistan or Afghanistan and were holding the people hostage. Others stated that the plane was taken to North Korea. Conspiracy theorists have also suggested that it was captured by the US and then flown to the military base at Diego Garcia, or that the US shot it down because they feared a 9/11 attack on that military base. Then, you get the way out there theories, like a mini black hole, or a meteor striking the plane, or an alien abduction. Missy Bevers murder. Another infamous case on this layer. The murder of Missy Bevers. This case has been heavily followed, mainly due to the security footage that was released to the press. Missy was a fitness instructor who regularly taught fitness classes in Midlothian's Creekside Church of Christ in Midlothian, Texas. The 45-year-old would wake up on the morning of April 18, 2016, and prepare to head to the church. The night before, she had told her students that the class would be held inside the church due to the expected bad weather that was to come, as the classes were typically held in the parking lot, and that weather did arrive. As there was a heavy thunderstorm that morning, Missy would be caught on camera entering the church at 4:18 a.m. to prepare her class, which started at 5. Shortly after 5, a student entered the church and was stunned to find Missy's body. Emergency services were called, and Missy was pronounced dead at the scene. She had several puncture wounds to the head and chest. Now about that security footage I mentioned, the detectives would look through this obviously, and although the cameras outside didn't work, the ones on the inside were fine. And what they discovered was around 4 a.m., the suspect enters the church's hallway, while occasionally smashing glass and attempting to open doors. He was wearing what appeared to be a SWAT police outfit and tactical gear from head to toe. He also wore a police-marked vest, black helmet, and black gloves, and carried some type of tool, most likely a hammer. The footage, although this part hasn't been released yet, would show Missy walking down the hallway before the murder, and we're not sure where they actually crossed paths because that part hasn't been disclosed. The suspect's walk has caused much conjecture. Some claim that it's a feminine walk, while others claim it could be a man with some type of medical issue. However, in 2021, the FBI asked Dr. Michael Nuremberg, who is a forensic podiatrist, to study the walk. After he studied the video, he would say that the weight of gear and weapons is what caused the walk, and that the gender could not be determined. He also discussed another thing the public hasn't seen yet, which was Missy walking down the hall and turning her head, as if she had heard something off camera. It was probably the moment she realized she wasn't alone. The suspect isn't the only mystery here, as investigators aren't sure of the motive either. It was originally believed that it was just a burglary gone wrong, yet nothing was missing from the church. Of course, maybe he found nothing of value. Missy also had several items in her purse of value though, such as an iPad, and that wasn't stolen either. Yet, maybe he was afraid he could get tracked if he took that. The other main theory is that Missy was targeted, and that the suspect planned to make it look like a burglary gone wrong. One warrant filed by the police even claimed that the suspect was using a smartphone to stalk Missy, and possibly even recorded her murder. Detectives also found one man who was sending her, quote, creepy and strange, end quote, messages on LinkedIn, while they also found flirtatious and intimate messages between Missy and another unnamed man. Her husband and father-in-law, who many have pointed the finger at, have ironclad alibis and have been ruled out as far as being the actual suspect. Although, police did discover that the marriage was fraught with financial issues and infidelity. There's also a 2010 to 2012 Nissan Altima that is seen in surveillance footage around the time of the murder, about a mile from the scene. Police have looked for this individual too, although they don't believe he was the suspect. He has never came forward either. 7 years later, and authorities say they are no closer to finding the suspect. Nazca Lines. In southern Peru lies a group of geoglyphs made in the soil of the Nazca Desert, known as the Nazca Lines. These mysterious lines were made between the years of 500 BC and 500 AD. They were created by people making depressions in the desert floor, removing the pebbles and leaving differently colored dirt exposed. Most lines run straight across the landscape, but there are some designs of animals and plants. They measure about 440 to 1200 yards across. The combined length of the known lines so far is around 800 miles long. and covers an area about 280 square miles. They are typically around 6 inches deep. The width of the lines vary considerably, but more than half of them are slightly more than 13 inches wide, while some of them are 6 feet wide. The lines are best seen from the air at around 1,600 feet, although they are visible from the surrounding foothills and other high places. Because it's so isolated and dry and windless, the lines have been mostly preserved. Hundreds of them are simple lines and shapes, but more than 70 of them are animals, including a hummingbird, spider, fish, condor, monkey, lizard, dog, cat, and a human. There's also trees and flowers. The first mention of them comes from 1553, when Pedro Cieza de Leon described them in his book as trail markers. They didn't gain real prominence, though, until 1927, when Peruvian pilots started seeing them from higher up. And the mystery is, just what were they designed for? One of the more prevalent theories relates to it being astronomy and cosmology, as it was common in other cultures. The lines were intended to act like an observatory, maybe to point to places on the distant horizon, where the sun and celestial bodies rose or set at the solstices. This was typical of indigenous cultures, where many of them, like Cahokia, constructed similar earthworks. Another theory was that they were built as irrigation systems for their fields, or built to collect rainwater. There's also the religious theories, suggestions that they built them to appease their gods. And this one has some merit, because climate in this region is pretty dry, only receiving about 20 minutes of rain per year. It could be that this was a ritual to plead with their gods to send more water. And finally, how can you go without mentioning ancient aliens? Eric von Daniken believed the mysterious lines were used as landing sites for UFOs, and that they were made by aliens to help steer their spaceships. North Carolina, Rumbling Mountains. In February of 1874, residents near Chimney Rock, North Carolina, would begin to feel the ground shake and hear loud booms coming from the direction of Bald Mountain, which is a 3,000-foot peak. Others would report to see smoke and vapor coming up from the earth. The community would start to speak of a possible volcano, and if that wasn't bad enough, the tremors continued for the next 2 months, leading to panic. This would of course attract the media, who would descend to the sparsely populated area. One story said that a local preacher, who had been holding a revival, prayed that God would move the strong hearts of the wicked people in the area by causing the mountain to shake and tremble beneath their feet. According to one resident, the very next day is when the tremors occurred. Of course, who knows if this was coincidence or divine intervention, but the damage was done. The residents freaked out and stopped working, releasing their farm animals into the woods, citing their few remaining days left on Earth. Or did they? Of course, the big city press was interested in this story, only to sell papers and poke fun at the country folk. And it's possible they exaggerated the details. They would actually come out and say that the residents were trying to pull off a hoax. But Professor Warren Dupree at Wofford College would actually go to the region and took a civil engineer with a dozen students and a preacher, for some reason. During the investigation, he did experience several tremors firsthand, but he found no smoking peaks or any warning signs of an active volcano, like he had read about in the papers. Actually, after he talked to residents, most of them would dispute ever saying that. It was then that he realized that the papers had made most of it up. He would state that it was just normal tremors. Later investigations would suggest that it could have been rocks falling in the vast network of caves under Bald Mountain, but no one is for sure. Nova Lesnaya Street Jane Doe. This is a super obscure one with very little info. On August 10th, 2006, a female murder victim was found on Nova Lesnaya Street in Moscow. It was later determined that she had been a victim of serial killer Alexander Elistratov. Between 2005 and 2007, he robbed and murdered 6 people working as a taxi driver, this one being one of his victims, yet nobody knows who she is. She was about 20 to 25 years old and probably Armenian. Like I said, not much on this one, I couldn't even find a photo. Oak Island Mystery. Made famous by the Curse of Oak Island TV show, this mystery revolves mainly around stories of an alleged buried treasure on Oak Island near Nova Scotia, but also some other weird paranormal things like UFO sightings on or near the island, as well as a curse that says 7 men will die searching for the treasure before it is found. The theories vary on exactly where the treasure is. There have been items of interest found that date back to hundreds of years ago, Yet, no real treasure site has been found after several digs by several different expeditions. One problem with the early accounts of the treasure is that the first official recording came in 1857, nearly 60 years after the actual first hunt, which occurred in 1799 or 1795, depending on the source. The story alleges a man named Daniel McGinnis found a depression in the ground in 1799 while looking for a location for a farm, or Daniel found it in 1795 while fishing. Regardless, McGinnis had heard of this story told by the early settlers that involved a dying sailor from the crew of Captain Kidd, which states that a treasure worth $2 million had been buried on the island. Now McGinnis believed he had found it and would go to get help from a couple of friends of his to help dig. After excavating, he would discover a layer of flagstones 2 feet deep. The accounts also mentioned some type of tool marks or pick scrapes on the walls. It was also noted that the earth was noticeably loose and not as hard packed as the surrounding soil. They would dig more and find a tier of rotten oak logs, and after 15 more feet, they found what they thought was a man-made shaft. The men would stop the excavation at 30 feet due to, quote, superstitious dread, end quote. And as previously noted, the first mention of this was in 1857, but there wasn't an actual interview done until Anthony Vaughan, one of the men who helped McGinnis dig, spoke to a reporter in 1862 about it. But since the first dig, there have been several expeditions, too many to go over in this format. And since the show has been on for nearly a decade now, I'm just going to go ahead and jump to the theories. Before we look at the treasure theories, let's look at the island theories. That one's more simple. There's basically 2 hypotheses. One is that there's no treasure on the island, and the pit is a natural phenomenon, probably a sinkhole, connected to passages or caverns, and that the so-called human-made pits people are finding is due to the natural accumulated debris in the sinkholes, which will leak to the ground being way softer, giving the impression that it had been dug before. The second theory is, hey, it's a real pirate treasure buried by Captain Kidd, although there's other spin-offs of this, such as it was the Templars, Masons, or even the Incans. And as far as the artifacts, some say it's a pirate treasure, some say it's lost Shakespearean manuscripts, while others take the religious route and say that the Holy Grail or Ark of the Covenant, which was said to have been buried there by the Knights Templar. There's also the theory that the Freemasons are hiding something there. Some have even speculated that Marie Antoinette's missing jewels have been hidden there. According to legend, Marie Antoinette instructed her maid to flee with the jewels when revolutionaries incited an angry mob to march on the Palace of Versailles. Yet, until some concrete proof is found, we'll just have to guess. Ontario Lake Mystery Ancient Structure. In the spring of 2005, Halliburton Forest and Wildlife Reserve would conduct a dive on McDonald Lake as part of a unique submarine project. The staff would come across an unusual stone structure, perched on top of a rock ledge at depths of 40 feet below the present lake level. They at first thought it might be what is called a glacial erratic, which simply refers to rocks that were carried by glaciers thousands of years ago and dumped wherever they happened to melt, sometimes leaving 2 to 3 rocks piled on each other, making it look like a structure. But after several geologists and archaeologists saw the images, they were stunned. They seen a 1,000-pound elongated and south-pointing rock sitting on baseball-sized stones that sat at each end, which in turn were resting on a massive, several thousand-pound slab on top of a ledge. They knew this didn't happen naturally. They would point to the straight edges and lack of roundness that would typically be carried by glaciers. They had to discard that theory, which left human-made. But how? An underwater archaeologist would go down to further investigate, taking a camera with him. When he came back up, he concluded that it was absolutely man-made. But who made it and why? What was the purpose? Divers after this would try to find some decorative images or any markings on the structure, but they couldn't find any. There is one theory by geologists who point to a huge drought that hit the area between 9000 and 7000 BC. It was so bad that even the Great Lakes were 150 feet lower, and lakes like McDonald Lake would have also been several feet lower. But that still leaves the question of, when there were so few humans in the area, why pick a remote lake like McDonald to build a stone cairn, especially one so large and elaborate? Overtoun Bridge. The Overtoun Bridge is a structure on the road to Overtoun House, near Dumbarton in West Dumbartonshire, Scotland. It was completed in 1895, and the reason that it's on this list is due to its numerous amount of reports of dogs either falling or jumping from the bridge, leading to many of their deaths, although sometimes they survive with terrible injuries. In at least one instance, a dog jumped off the bridge, survived, ran back up, and jumped again. Depending on the source, 300 to 600 dogs have jumped with at least 50 confirmed deaths. So what is causing this? Well, canine psychologist David Sands proposed that due to an optical illusion, combined with the odor of male mink urine in the area, is somehow luring the dogs to jump off. An investigation by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds did find that the end where most of the dogs were jumping from contained, quote, nests of mice, squirrels, and minks, end quote. The owner of the Overtoun house, who has lived there for a couple of decades, has witnessed many dogs getting agitated, jumping up, and then falling from the bridge. He claimed that it was the scent of the minks and other small game that lure the dogs to jump up onto the wall of the bridge, and then they just topple over. But of course, there's the paranormal theories. People claim that dogs are more sensitive to supernatural activity, and that there are dark spirits there that are leading the dogs over the wall. And with that, we finished part 8 of this iceberg. We are now 2/3 of the way through layer 3. I want to take the time to say thank you for listening.